Speaker.
E te atua kaharawa, ka tuku whakamoemiti atu mātou mō ngā karakia ko waihotia mai ki runga i a mātou. Ka waiho i o mātou pānga, whai aro katoa ki te taha, ka mihi mātou ki te kingi me te inoi atu. Mo te ārahitanga i roto i o mātou whakaaro arohanga, kia mōhio ai, kia whakaiti ai tā mātou, whakahaere i ngā take o te wharenei mo te oranga, te maungarongo me te aroha o Aotearoa. Āmene.
I'm sure members would wish to welcome Stephen Twigg, Secretary-General of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, who is present in the gallery. Petitions have been delivered to the clerk for presentation. Point of order, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, can I take this opportunity just to remind the Parliament that we are holding a reception for Mr Twigg in your lounge at 6 o'clock, and I would appreciate if as many members as possible could come to meet the gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you. Petitions have been delivered to the clerk for presentation.
Petition of Atkar Zaman requesting that the House require banks to reduce their mortgage interest rates. Petition of Jared Rigg requesting that the House urgently revise the Citizenship Act 1977 to grant automatically at birth citizenship by birth to any child born overseas to a New Zealand citizen who was born in New Zealand.
Those petitions stand referred to the Petitions Committee. Ministers have delivered papers.
2021-22 annual reports for the New Zealand Productivity Commission, Government Superannuation Fund, Public Trust, Education New Zealand, Teaching Council of Aotearoa New Zealand, Civil Aviation Authority, Government Communications Security Bureau, New Zealand Security Intelligence Service. 2022-23 Statement of Performance Expectations for Auckland Light Rail Limited and the Pharmaceutical Management Agency. 2022-24 Statement of Intent for Auckland Light Rail Limited.
I present the report of the of the Controller and Auditor General entitled Tertiary Education Institutions 2021 Audit Results and What We Saw in 2022. Those papers are published under the authority of the House. Select Committee reports have been delivered for presentation.
Reports of the Economic Development, Science and Innovation Committee on the 2021-22 annual reviews of New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, Broadcasting Standards Authority, Commerce Commission, Electricity Authority, External Reporting Board, Financial Markets Authority, New Zealand Tourism Board, AgResearch Limited, NIWA and New Zealand Forest Institute, Research Forest Institute Limited, annual reviews of ESR, GNS and Landcare Research New Zealand Limited, 2021-22 annual reviews of the Accreditation Council, Real Estate Agents Authority and Retirement Commissioner, Grocery Industry Competition Bill and Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, Long-Term Insights Briefing 2022. Report of the Education and Workforce Committee on the Worker Protection, Migrant and Other Employees Bill. Reports of the Environment Committee on the 2021-22 annual reviews of Predator-Free 2050 Limited and the Ministry for the Environment. Reports of the Finance and Expenditure Committee on the 2021-22 annual reviews of Kiwi Group Holdings Limited, Autocaro Limited, Southern Response Earthquake Services Limited, Government's Superannuation Fund, Guardians of New Zealand Superannuation, Inland Revenue Department, New Zealand Infrastructure Commission, Office of the Controller and Auditor General, Pike River Recovery Agency, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the Treasury, and the financial statements of the Government of New Zealand for the year ended 30th of June 2022. Report of the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee on the 2021-22 annual reviews of the New Zealand Customs Service and the Border Executive Board. Reports of the Governance and Administration Committee on the 2021-22 annual review of Statistics New Zealand and of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Reports of the Intelligence and Security Committee on the 2021-22 annual reviews of the Government Communications Security Bureau and the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service. Reports of the Petitions Committee on the petitions of Sina Shad and 2 petitions of Wendy Baker. Reports of the Primary Production Committee on the briefing on the Forests Legal Harvest Assurance Amendment Bill and the increased penalties for breach of biosecurity bill.
The bills are set down for second reading. The briefings and the report on the financial statement of the government are set down for consideration. The clerk has been informed of the introduction of bills.
Immigration, Mass Arrivals Amendment Bill, introduction. Resale Right for Visual Artists Bill, introduction. Education and Training Amendment Bill number 3, introduction. Regulatory Systems Education Amendment Bill, introduction. Child Support Pass On Acts Amendment Bill, introduction. Severe Weather Emergency Recovery Legislation Bill, introduction. Integrity Sport and Recreation Bill, introduction.
Those bills are set down for first reading. The House comes to oral questions. Question number 1 in the name of Christopher Luxon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and reads, does he stand by all of his government statements and actions?
Mr Speaker.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, in particular this government's actions that mean from the end of this week around 1.4 million New Zealanders will have a bit more money in their pockets to help deal with the cost of living. While the measures that we've taken alone won't fix everything, and we've still got more work to do to bring down inflation and the cost of living, they will make a difference. And right now I know that every little bit helps when it comes to making ends meet.
Does he agree with his new Education Minister that no progress has been made lifting achievement for kids about to enter high school in the last 5 years? And is this acceptable when half are below expectation in reading, writing and maths?
Mr Speaker, I reject that that's what the Minister of Education said. What we have done as a government is remove national standards and replace it with a system where progression and student progress can be better managed, better measured and reported to parents. That is a stark contrast with national standards which set our education system back.
Will he join National in committing to a target of 80% of Year 8s being at or above curriculum by 2030?
Mr Speaker, the member can set all sorts of targets. So the reality is what we want to make sure is that students are making progress, that progress is visible to their parents, and that our performance in these areas does improve. I would note that the primary measure that the member has been using and many others have been using are our results in PISA, which measure the results of our 15-year-olds when it comes to literacy and numeracy. Those 15-year-olds were at primary school during their formative years for literacy and numeracy while national standards were in place.
Why did he reject the Royal Society's recommendation to require primary and intermediate students to do at least an hour of maths each day?
Mr Speaker, schools make decisions around how they structure the school learning day, and actually I trust the judgment of teachers to create an environment that's stimulating for young people so that they are learning the curriculum that they need to.
If the status quo is so good, why after 5 years of this government did 2/3 of our Year 10 students fail a basic writing, reading and maths test?
Mr Speaker, that was a pilot test that was being put in place to test the new literacy and numeracy standards that this government is putting in place, because we're not satisfied that the literacy and numeracy requirements for the NCEA that were put in place under the last government are actually resulting in our school leavers leaving school with the literacy and numeracy skills that they need.
Does he stand by his 2019 statement that the curriculum needs a stronger focus on well-being, identity, language and culture? Or does he now agree that the #1 priority must be teaching the basics of maths, reading and writing?
Mr Speaker, unlike that member, I don't think those two things are incompatible. I think if you create an environment where students want to be, where their well-being is well catered for, then they'll do better in those core areas of the curriculum. There is an abundance of evidence that will suggest that.
How do you spend $5 billion more and hire 1,400 more staff and not improve the outcomes for reading, writing or maths?
Mr Speaker, I note that a significant proportion of that money has gone on salaries of teachers. I note that the opposition seem to be saying we should be paying teachers more.
Does he agree it takes a very, very special skill to spend more, to hire more and yet deliver worse education outcomes?
Mr Speaker, I completely reject the premise of the member's question. This government is spending more. We are paying our teachers better, unlike the salary freeze that they experienced under the time of the last national government. We are increasing the support that we've got in specialist learning areas where we know that young people have been left behind. I make no apology for putting more increases into learning support in the 5 years we've been in government than the last government did in the 9 years that they were in government. Some of our most vulnerable kids that they chose to ignore deserve the support that they've been getting under our government. And I also make no apology for the significant investment that we have made in cleaning up the infrastructure deficit in our education system that we inherited from his government.
Supplementary.
Question number two. Supplementary, David Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister stand by his earlier statement that his government's policy is to raise pensions, main benefits, student allowances and the minimum wage by the rate of inflation this April Fool's Day? And if so, why?
Mr. Speaker, yes, I do. I'm not sure how April Fool's Day comes into it.
Supplementary. Later. Is there an equivalent policy that will raise the incomes of roughly 2.8 million New Zealanders whose after-tax income is falling behind inflation because they get their money from an old-fashioned thing called working, or are they the real April Fools?
Mr. Speaker, the member might want to look at the statistics around wage growth, which shows that New Zealanders' wages continue to grow. And in fact, they've grown more quickly in the last couple of years than they have prior to that. We've got work to do to ensure that we're making work pay. I note that the measures that this government has put in place to increase workers' wages have all been opposed by that member and his party.
Supplementary. Is the Prime Minister aware then, in light of what he just said, that taxes paid by working people have risen faster than inflation and their after-tax income has fallen behind inflation in the last year? And if he doesn't know, why not?
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, workers' incomes have been growing under this government. That is something that we are very proud of. And I note that the measures that we've put in place that have helped that, such as increasing the minimum wage, such as improving the ability of workers to bargain, to get better pay, and the measures that we've taken to increase the pay of some of our most essential workers, like our teachers, our nurses, our doctors, our police, our firefighters, all opposed by that member and his party.
Supplementary. Does the Prime Minister not understand that if people's after-tax incomes are growing slower than inflation, then none of those policies have worked?
Mr. Speaker, I do accept that the inflationary environment that we are in at the moment is putting households under pressure. It's one of the reasons that I've made cost of living one of the central focuses of the work of this government. We want to get inflation back down again. And one of the things that the only solution the opposition parties, National and ACT, seem to be able to come up with has the potential to stoke inflation higher.
What does it say that this government's tax and benefit policies have made sure working for a living is less rewarding while getting money transferred from other taxpayers via his government has become more rewarding? In other words, does he know why his party's called Labour?
Speaker, I completely reject the premise of the member's question. On this side of the House, we are focused on making sure that people who work hard can get ahead.
Supplementary. If national standards are to blame, why did the former Minister of Education, Chris Hipkins, say in this House, and does he stand by his statement still today, quote, "I don't think national standards are to blame for it. I don't think they fixed it, but I don't think they are to blame for it."
Mr. Speaker, I say the member should read the whole quote.
Question number two, Angie Warren-Clark.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Social Development and Employment and asks, what progress has been made to pass on child support to sole parent beneficiaries?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr. Speaker, in Budget 2022, we announced we would pass on child support to parents receiving a sole parent rate of benefit. It has been an incredibly complicated process to progress this policy, but I'm pleased to inform the House that we are ready to bring forward the legislation and it will be in place in time for the 1st of July. Currently, the government retains child support payments for sole parents who get a benefit from MSD, up to the rate of their benefit rather than being passed on to support their children. However, this is not the case for other beneficiaries. The bill, which will be read in the House this week, will end this injustice and child support payments will be passed on to the sole parents who need it the most.
Supplementary. Why are we making this change?
Mr Speaker, the current way we deal with child support for beneficiaries is discriminatory. Money that should be treated as income and used by parents to help provide for their children is being taken by the state. This differs from parents who have found a new partner and are receiving a couple's rate of benefit. These beneficiaries get to keep their child support, and this is what causes the discrimination. This anomaly in the system dates back to 1936, and change is long overdue. Through this legislation, this government is delivering on its commitment to put dignity back in the welfare system and make it fairer. Equitable treatment of sole parent whānau will also mean a fairer deal for women who make up 88% of all sole parent benefit clients.
What impact will the changes make?
Mr Speaker, amending the rules will provide better support to parents and lift up to 14,000 children out of poverty. The changes build on the progress we have been making to improve people's lives through our Families Package and welfare reforms. It is estimated that 41,550 sole parent families will be better off with a median gain of $20 per week. This means more cash in hand to support whānau coping with the increasing costs of living. This proposal also has the potential to strengthen the child support scheme. If parents know that the child support they pay will get to their own children, it will encourage more parents to pay. There is also evidence that if child support is passed on, it increases engagement by the parent paying child support with their child. This is much better for families in general.
Supplementary. How will the bill be implemented?
Mr Speaker, under this bill, when a sole parent receives child support, the normal monthly payment they receive will be spread equally and charged across 4 or 5 weeks against their benefits. The Ministry of Social Development will then treat this child support as income for their assistance using automated systems. This approach will reduce the likelihood of debt accumulation and demands on the time of these families. Due to the complexity of the changes required to the welfare system to facilitate this, our government is taking a phased approach to implementation. Phase 1 of the bill will deliver most of the changes, resulting in extra cash in hand for the vast majority of whānau on a sole parent benefit from July. Phase 2 will tackle the policy features that apply to more complex payment cases, and will provide more detail on this as we work through the changes. By phasing the rollout, we can achieve the full benefit of the changes straight away for the vast majority of eligible parents.
Question number 3, Nicola Willis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, does he stand by his statement from May 2022 that even if the inflation spike is expected to be temporary, this doesn't take away from the significant impact it is having? And given inflation has now persisted outside the Reserve Bank target range for 21 months, does he now regret his decision to increase new government operating spending by $38.7 billion in the 2022 budget?
The Honourable Grant Robertson.
Speaker, I stand by my statement in its full context. In answer to the second part of the question, the member is well aware that rising inflation has been a global issue. The government needs to maintain a balanced approach to be fiscally sustainable whilst also supporting New Zealanders. I can say to the member that I most certainly do not regret putting $11.1 billion of funding for a new multi-year funding framework for a nationwide health system after years of neglect of funding. I do not regret putting in place $2.85 billion of operating and capital funding for education to make sure that our students, our teachers and their wider whānau have resources and schools that they can be proud of. I do not regret putting in place $2.9 billion for mitigating and adapting to climate change and reducing emissions after years of cheap talk rather than action in that area, Mr Speaker. And I do not regret putting in place $1 billion of cost of living initiatives so that low and middle income New Zealanders can be helped through a difficult period of time.
Does he stand by his decision to embark on a government spend-a-thon in Budget 2022, and can he seriously claim that New Zealand taxpayers have got value from every dollar he added to the inflation fire?
Mr Speaker, it's interesting to note, and I'll take the member back to April and May of 2022, where her leader, and indeed her, committed to spending the same amount of money that the government was spending. But But in the middle of doing that, they committed to $11 billion worth of tax cuts that would target the wealthiest New Zealanders, the most inflationary thing they could possibly think of.
Why has inflation in the United States, Canada and Singapore fallen heavily from their peaks last year, but inflation in New Zealand has barely budged?
Mr. Speaker, currently on the latest numbers at the end, which are consistent at the end of the December quarter, New Zealand has the 10th lowest inflation rate out of the 38-odd OECD countries, Mr. Speaker. This is a global issue. As the member noted in the quote that she helpfully put in the question, whatever debate we might have about comparisons, I accept that for New Zealanders right now, the cost of living is tough. That's why this government's prioritised it. That's why we've got increases in place right across the board for low and middle income New Zealanders. And as the Prime Minister has pointed out, those increases, that support to actually help people with the cost of living has been opposed by the National Party.
Does he think the Prime Minister agrees with his characterisation of Budget 2022 in answer to his first question, that every dollar was well spent? And if that is the case, why has he wound back on so many of the extravagant spending promises that minister committed to?
Mr. Speaker, if the member listened carefully to the answer I gave, the examples I use, for example, in health spending are ones where I know the Prime Minister is extremely proud of the investments we've made. He's already indicated in his answers today how proud he is of the fact that we came in when we inherited a massive deficit in our education infrastructure, that we actually invested in repairing that. So I know, Mr. Speaker, that this government had to come in, had to spend to make up for what National did for 9 years to deal with the COVID pandemic. But I come back, Mr. Speaker, if the member wants to go back to May 2022, she was committing to spending the same amount of money with a worse inflationary impact.
Is he aware that the official measure of mortgage arrears has hit its highest level since the 2020 lockdown? And how many more New Zealanders does he expect to go under as they switch to vastly higher interest rates this year?
Mr. Speaker, as I have indicated, the pressure of the cost of living on New Zealand households is something that we are acutely aware of. That's why we have prioritised to act to support New Zealand households through this period of time. The member knows that inflation is a global problem, and in this country we are managing it to support New Zealanders through this difficult time.
Why does he continue to defend his big spending economic management approach when it has led to prices growing faster than wages, growing faster than exports, employment and GDP? And why should New Zealanders trust a government that has only taken them backwards?
Mr. Speaker, the reason that I believe in what we're doing is because it's contributed to making sure that New Zealand is in one of the strongest positions of any economy in the world to deal with the challenges of 2023. We have unemployment at historic lows. We have one of the lowest levels of public debt. We have an economy that's 6% larger than it was before COVID that many other countries can't do, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for her belief in my great powers to control all matters to do with inflation, but I would point her to her mentor in 2016, Bill English, who, when asked similar types of questions to this, made the point that it's actually the Reserve Bank's job to keep inflation between 1% and 3%. Perhaps the member might like to listen to her former boss.
Question number 4, Debbie Ngārewa-Peka.
Tēnā koe te māngai. My question is to the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction. Why did she say that this year's child poverty figures are encouraging, and has she seen reports that 1 in 10 children and 1 in 5 tamariki Māori experience material hardship, meaning that their whānau can't afford essentials like regular healthy food, doctor's visits, or to pay their power bills?
Mr. Speaker, to the first part of the question, my comment was in relation to the fact that despite the most challenging economic conditions in a generation or more, actions taken by this government have ensured New Zealand children have not fallen backwards as was originally predicted. The fact that 8 out of 9 child poverty measures have seen a statistically significant decrease since 2018 shows the effectiveness of the measures we have put in place to support families over several years. However, as in previous years, disparities continue to be evident for Māori and Pacific children and children impacted by disability compared to New Zealand children overall. To the second part of the question, yes, I have seen those figures, and while there are children living in poverty, we know there is more work to do, and this government is absolutely committed to doing so.
Supplementary. What is her response to the fact that the reality is likely even worse than the figures reflect, given that the whānau struggling the most, such as those who are homeless, living in cars, garages and motels, were not even surveyed in this data?
Mr Speaker, the Household Economics Survey collects data from resident individuals of private dwellings. This means that there are some families and individuals who live long-term in non-private dwellings like emergency housing, but also camping grounds, hostels and aged care facilities who are not within the survey population. However, Stats advises me, including these children with the reported rates, would not change the outcomes reported in the data. Stats New Zealand also tells me it is continually reviewing the approach taken to produce child poverty statistics to ensure that they are reflective of the experiences of New Zealand households.
Supplementary. Isn't it also true that material hardship will be much worse right now, as the survey included data ended June 2022, and food prices have gone up 12% in the last year, the biggest annual increase since 1989?
Mr Speaker, what I can say is that material hardship would be a lot worse if we had sat and done nothing. This is why this government has acted, because that we know that reducing child poverty is paramount.
Supplementary. Does she agree with the answers, that the answers lie in agencies working more closely with whānau hapu, iwi and community leaders, as argued by many experts, including the Children's Commissioner, who said these groups are trusted by Māori and Pacifica communities that simply do not trust government agencies, and as a result either don't reach out for help or aren't comfortable sharing full details of their true situation? If not, why not?
Mr Speaker, I have been in consultation and communication with many of those particular agencies and groups. I know that they are most trusted groups and they are important partners in this drive to ensure that we reduce child poverty.
Supplementary.
The Honourable Carmel Sikalama.
To the Minister, is it true to say that the most recent child poverty statistics don't include the full impact of the more recent increase to benefits, child support pass-on, and the bigger rollout of food in schools program?
Mr Speaker, yes, that is absolutely correct. What this government is doing is continually looking at measures of how we can reduce child poverty. This is a continuing main part of our work program, and we will continue to look at any way we can to make sure that child poverty is reducing.
What specific tangata whenua and community policies or initiatives can she guarantee government will support and resource in response to the latest child poverty statistics?
Mr Speaker, what I can say is that everything is still on the table in what we are looking at to reduce child poverty. We absolutely will make sure that we are keeping our Māori, tamariki Māori at the centre of what we are doing and making certain that we are reducing child poverty for all.
I don't think the Minister actually, point of order.
Point of order, Te Bingaru, would they go?
I don't think the Minister answered or replied to the actual question was what specific tangata whenua and community policies or initiatives?
I'll get you to ask it again. I'm not sure.
What specific tangata whenua and community policies or initiatives can she guarantee government will support and resource in response to the latest child poverty statistics?
Mr Speaker, while I won't go into specifics, what I can say is that we are working on that right at this point in time, and what I did say, Mr Speaker, that is everything is still on the table.
Question number 5, Rachel Boyer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Housing, What impact has the recent severe weather had on Kāinga Ora's work programme?
The
Speaker.
Honourable Dr Megan Woods.
Kāinga Ora estimates that at this stage, approximately 850 new public homes that were expected to be delivered by June 2023 are now subject to an up to 8-week delay in their construction program. Prior to the recent weather events, Kāinga Ora was on track in January to meet the government's ambitious public housing plan of delivering 3,400 homes by June 2023. The delays have been caused by direct damage to our sites, lost construction time in preparation and clean-up after the events, as well as indirect consequential impacts on the supply chain and issues such as delays in inspections, consentings and approvals. I'll continue to work with Kāinga Ora to actively manage delays and mitigate the impacts of Auckland's floods and Cyclone Gabrielle.
Supplementary. What construction sites were affected by the cyclone and flooding?
Mr Speaker, the weather events had a number of impacts on all construction sites, including Kāinga Ora's. This included direct impacts on earthworks, foundations, materials, water ingress and flooding. Work was paused across multiple sites during the cyclone, with further time required afterwards to clean up the sites, dry them out, make them safe and remobilise before any work could be restarted. For example, the Graves Avenue sites, which will deliver approximately 200 units in Auckland, there was flooding in the basement and lift pits and damage to joinery stored in the basement. Given the joiner's factory was also flooded by the same weather event, this has presented challenges with producing the replacement joinery. In Napier, for example, a construction site was directly impacted by limited road access and supply of materials to site, causing disruptions.
Supplementary. What indirect impacts were felt by the cyclone and flooding?
Mr Speaker, there have been indirect impacts on build partners and supply chains. For example, labour and machinery was diverted to assist with emergency responses. Councils reprioritised staff and other regulatory building services to undertake emergency building assessments, which had knock-on effects of delaying consenting, inspections and approvals. Examples including Gisborne, where 8 projects were impacted by delays as contractors were unavailable to work on Kāinga Ora sites due to assisting with the emergency response. There were also shortages of water, fuel and materials such as plasterboard and concrete.
Supplementary. Have the weather events impacted other parts of the country?
Mr Speaker, other areas of New Zealand also experienced the diversion of materials and labour. For example, some territorial authorities have diverted building inspection staff to affected areas, including Wellington Council staff sent to assist with Auckland. Major infrastructure providers also focus staff and machinery in priority areas. Civil contractors, engineers, machinery and materials are being mobilised from outside affected areas, restricting resources in the rest of the country.
Question number 6, the Honourable Louise Upston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Prevention of Family and Sexual Violence and asks, when did she say that, I am a prevention violence minister and I know who causes violence in this world and it's white, cis men? Why?
The Honourable Marama Davidson.
Mr Speaker, is that different from the primary question that was listed?
Why?
Yeah, it's meant to be why at the beginning.
Do you want me to ask again? Please, thanks. Why did she say that, quote, I am a prevention violence minister and I know who causes violence in this world and it's white, cis men, unquote?
The Honourable Marama Davidson.
Mr Speaker, I know that to transform generations of hurt and trauma and to stop violence from happening in the first place as a country, we must have the hard and uncomfortable conversations. We need to talk about the power imbalances and gender narratives that underpin much of the violence that occurs in our country. As the Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence and Sexual Violence, I will continue to have those conversations. Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that I could have been clearer in my remarks on Saturday. What I was doing was pushing back on the harmful and false narrative that trans people are one of the biggest risks to women. And this is simply not true. Violence happens in every community. Any person can be a victim of violence, but we cannot get away from the fact that the perpetrators of sexual violence or family violence are mostly men. And so, Mr. Speaker, now that I have clarified what I intended to say, let's have a conversation about what to do next to build an Aotearoa New Zealand.
Order. You well and truly answered. You now going into a speech on the matter. Supplementary.
Was she asked by the Prime Minister to apologise to the public? And if so, when will she do that?
It was really, Mr. Speaker, it was really important to me that I clarify what I intended to say. And so in a public statement, I have appealed directly to the community, to the field experts, and to victim survivors, and clarified what I intended to say and affirmed and acknowledged victims and survivors who may not have seen themselves in my comments.
That's definitely not an answer to the question that was made. I'm going to, the member can have 2 additional supplementaries.
Was she asked by the Prime Minister to apologise to the public? And if so, when will she do that?
No.
Supplementary.
The Honourable Louise Upston.
Does she agree that the statement was factually incorrect?
What I have done is clarified what I intended to say. Mr. Speaker, what I need to be really clear about is that violence is enabled by socially accepted hierarchies of power that include sexism, racism towards minority communities, colonisation, ableism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia and classism, and I am really clear about those drivers of violence and that we must change those structures of inequality and power.
Karen Shaw, supplementary.
Does she accept that her words, "I know who causes violence in the world and it's cis men, were offensive and highly inappropriate to victims of family and sexual violence? And will she apologise today to them for making a mockery of such a serious issue?"
What I have done is clarified what I intended to say directly in a public statement and make it really clear that I was wanting to push back hard on the untruth and harm about trans people being the biggest threat to women, and this is simply not true. And that my intention was to highlight the structures of power that are behind the drivers of violence, and I will continue to make that point.
Supplementary.
The Honourable Louise Upson.
Does she stand by her statement in Te Urakura, which is the action plan for the national strategy to eliminate family violence and sexual violence, which quotes her words, "To enable safe communities where all people are respected"? And why does she not accept that her words did not respect cis white men?
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely stand by every single word in Te Aorere Kura that was created by and with the community, with victims, with survivors, with sector experts, with tangata whenua and diverse communities, and again state that this is why it was important to me to clarify what I intended to say.
Supplementary.
Karen Shaw, supplementary.
If she can apologise to the Prime Minister for saying, "I know who causes violence in the world and it's white cis men," why can't she apologise to the victims of family and sexual violence for belittling their trauma for political gain?
What I have said to the Prime Minister is that I clarified that those are not the words that I normally use.
Supplementary. Why will she then not apologise to New Zealanders for the offensive words that she has used?
It is important to me to clarify, especially directly to victims and survivors who may not have seen themselves in the words that I use, and this is why I have made it clear what I intended to say.
Question number 7, Shannon Halbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question to the Minister of Transport. What recent announcements has the government made about electric vehicle charging?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr. Speaker, last week I launched public consultation on charging our future Aotearoa New Zealand's first EV charging strategy. The strategy, which the Minister of Energy and Resources, Megan Woods, and I have developed over recent months with the sector, sets out a vision and plan to develop a first world EV charging infrastructure that is accessible, affordable and reliable. Emissions from our light vehicle fleet are the single largest source of transport emissions in New Zealand, partially due to having some of the most fuel inefficient and emissions intensive vehicles in the OECD. We know that increasing zero emission vehicles to 30% of the light vehicle fleet by 2035 will require tens of thousands of public and private chargers to be rolled out around the country. The strategy proposes that we work alongside the private sector and local government to facilitate infrastructure that supports the different trips and journeys that EV drivers make and ensures that rural and provincial New Zealand locations are accessible for residents and visitors with EVs.
Supplementary. What targets does the EV charging strategy set out?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the government recently completed its work to deliver EV chargers every 75 kilometres along 97% of the state highway network. The strategy proposes a new set of targets that will support the national rollout of chargers in the coming years. These include large journey charging hubs every 150 to 200 kilometres at key locations on our state highways to help manage range anxiety and support tourism. Chargers for every 20 to 40 EVs in highly developed urban areas to support EV uptake in those places. And public charging at community facilities for all towns and cities with 2,000 or more people to ensure that the distribution of chargers is equitable in all parts of New Zealand.
What responses has he seen to the launch of the EV charging strategy?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've seen a range of responses to the launch, and I've been encouraged to see ChargeNet, the AA and Jolt all come out in support of the strategy. Those organisations were all positive about the role of the government in setting out the strategy and to work alongside private sector charging providers to support investment in infrastructure ahead of the rollout of EV chargers across the network. We're working alongside the sector through the Clean Car Leadership Group as we've developed the draft strategy, and will continue to work closely with industry and local government as we finalise the strategy. Mr. Speaker, right across New Zealand, Kiwis are getting in behind cleaner vehicles. That's something that we understand on this side of the House, even if the other side still knock it.
What other work is the government doing to support the uptake of low and zero emission vehicles?
Mr. Speaker, the EV charging strategy will complement the government's work to support the uptake of low and zero emission vehicles through the highly successful Clean Car Discount and Clean Car Standard. We're seeing massive progress with more than 70,000 EVs now on our roads, 70% more than at the end of 2021. In December 2022, 30% of all new passenger car sales were electric, making us one of the world's leading markets for EVs. And as recent Drive Electric analysis showed, that has the potential to remove 2 million tonnes of carbon from our carbon emissions by the 2030s. Our government is serious about tackling climate change, and these policies are making a real difference.
Question number 8, the Honourable Julianne Genter.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koutou e te whare. My question is to the Minister of Transport. Does he stand by his comments that when it comes to decarbonising transport, quote, the longer the action is delayed, the more difficult it gets?
The Honourable Michael Wood.
Mr. Speaker, yes. That's why as Minister I've prioritised a range of policies that are helping to drive down the transport sector's emissions, including the Clean Car Discount and Clean Car Standard, rolling out EV chargers, a massive investment to rebuild a resilient and reliable rail network, and supporting the uptake of public transport, walking and cycling through projects and programs like Transport Choices, the Eastern Busway, Christchurch PT Futures, and Te Ara Tupua, the visionary shared path around the Wellington Harbour.
Supplementary, can he confirm that recent government decisions make it much harder to meet its 2025 transport emissions targets? And what new actions, if any, will the government take to reach that target?
Mr Speaker, the member in her question is probably referring primarily to the government's recent prioritisation decision around the sustainable biofuels mandate, a decision which I do note that the member supported. As she pointed out at that time, we do now need to do the work to make sure that we have the suite of other transport policies to make up for that emissions shortfall. But I can confirm that the government remains resolutely committed to the carbon budgets that we are committed to through the emissions reduction plan, and we're continuing to work on policies across improvements to the vehicle fleet, and I've just answered a question around our EV charging strategy, and we'll do further work in terms of how we can support more Kiwis to have real transport choices so they're better able to use low carbon options like public transport and safe walking and cycling.
Is the government on track to meet its 2025 transport emissions target? And if not, what will his government do to reach the target?
Well, Mr Speaker, as I covered in my previous question, the major change that we've had in recent months has been the decision around the sustainable biofuels mandate. That does leave an additional emissions abatement that we have to reach, and that's why we're developing policies at the moment to make sure that we do reach that budget.
Is the ongoing Fed and RUC discount during a climate emergency short-sighted, considering it increases carbon emissions by 35,000 to 83,000 tonnes at a cost of at least $1.3 billion to date? If not, why not?
Mr Speaker, the government's policy of Fed and RUC reductions have been an important part of our response to the cost of living pressures that New Zealanders have been experiencing. It means that the average New Zealander filling up their car saves $17 per tank, but it's also coupled with the half-price public transport policy, which will save an average public transport user who's using a bus 2 times a day around about $25 per week. Set in the context of our broader transport emission reductions policies, the additional emissions as a result of that policy are very small indeed, and I'm confident that with further work we will reach those targets that we've set.
Does he think it's fair that the hugely expensive discounts for Fed and RUC give 3 times the support to the highest income earners as to the lowest income earners?
Mr Speaker, what I know is that for all Kiwis, including low-income earners, the reductions that we have brought in place through the reductions to Fed and RUC and half-price public transport are making a real difference in terms of those household budgets. We know that it is challenging for many New Zealanders as they deal with the cost of living, and this is one of the more practical and quick stand-up things that we have been able to do to support those people.
Is he aware that the commuter trains from Palmerston North and the Wairarapa are unlikely to pass safety tests when they are renewed for service in 2027? And if so, will he commit to meeting the regional councils and Waka Kotahi halfway with funding for hybrid electric trains to replace them?
Mr Speaker, the government remains in very positive dialogue with Greater Wellington Regional Council about the proposals that they have presented to the government in terms of the replacement of rolling stock and increase in services along those lines. I do note that the proposals that they have put to the government ask the government to go much more than halfway in terms of the funding requirement, but it is a positive discussion that we are having with them.
Close Walker.
Has the Minister had any advice on the impacts of proposed Auckland Council budget cuts that would permanently slash 1,000 plus buses a day in our largest city in which transport is the largest emissions profile?
Mr Speaker, I continue to engage with my officials about the decisions that Auckland Council and other local authorities are making about the future of public transport services. And what I can confirm is that our government will continue to provide the support that we need to give Kiwis those real transport choices. That's why that half-price public transport until the middle of this year is important. That's why the $50 million in the budget last year to bring up bus driver pay and conditions is important so that we can continue to roll out those services. That's why the $800 million that we're investing in the Eastern Busway in Auckland is important. That's why the $70 million that we've committed to Christchurch PT Futures is important, and that's why the Transport Choices program that's going to roll out 100 kilometres of bus lanes all around the country is important. Our government's backing public transport, and we'll work with local authorities to deliver better services.
Question number 9, Nicole McKee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the new Minister of Police and reads, does she stand by her statement, quote, "My single focus will be for improving community safety," end quote. If so, why did she not attend the Esk Valley meeting for residents to address their concerns about levels of crime in the region following Cyclone Gabrielle?
E te mangai o te whare.
The Honourable Ginny Anderson.
Mr Speaker, yes, by backing our police, by reducing retail and organised crime and responding to youth offending and the underlying drivers of crime, I am absolutely committed to improving community safety. To the second part of that member's question, I was and still am scheduled to travel to the region to hear from locals and to meet with local police later in the week. I also note that the local MP attended the meeting.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementaries are heard and silent. Nicole McKee.
What message does it send to the residents of Esk Valley that neither the police minister nor any police attended the community meeting over the weekend to hear the residents' concerns about ongoing crime?
Mr Speaker, first of all, Mr Speaker, I wish to acknowledge the devastating impacts of Cyclone Gabrielle on the community of the Esk Valley and the surrounding region. It is in that context why there was increased police presence and response to that community, and that is why I am taking the action to go up to that community to check in with community members and frontline police on Friday this week.
Supplementary. Does she agree with Stuart Nash's concession at that meeting regarding the cyclone response that police, quote, didn't quite get it right, end quote? And if so, what does she think that he was referring to?
Mr Speaker, it is my expectation as Minister of Police that police not only respond to criminal activity, but also provide reassurance to the community as well. That is why police are maintaining very high visibility through the community. That is why there are still extra staff in the district who have carried out thousands of reassurance patrols. And that is why there are 3 police bases that are encouraging people who may feel unsafe to call the Priority 105 line that has been set up specifically for people in the cyclone-affected communities. In addition to that, Mr Speaker, Eastern District Police are working with the Council that will be attending a range of community meetings next week to support those severely impacted by Cyclone Gabrielle.
Point of order.
Point of order, Nicole McKee.
When I refer to my second supplementary question, I don't believe that the Minister actually addressed it.
Yeah, and I actually thought about ruling it out of order based on the Minister doesn't actually have that responsibility, but I allowed the question to be asked. Have you got further questions? Point of order, David Seymour.
To be clear, that the question was about the Minister's opinion on a statement, not taking responsibility for the statement.
Honourable Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, many times in this House we've had rulings that that particular point of order that the members just raised is in fact not a point of order, because the first matter is the matter of responsibility, and that is what you've ruled.
Supplementary, Nicole McKee.
What does she say to the mother from Esk Valley who told us that there are still strangers shining torches into her children's bedrooms at night? And does she agree with her colleague Stuart Nash, who characterised this as just a perceived risk?
Mr Speaker, I understand that the community in the Esk Valley are going through an incredibly tough time right now, and that is exactly why I am visiting Esk Valley this Friday, and that is why police continue to monitor the situation. Should the community require additional support from police, they are there to help.
Question number 10, Anna Lork.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development.
How is the government supporting coastal shipping between Gisborne and Napier?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Kiritapu Allen.
Mr Speaker, earlier this month, the Prime Minister and I were in Gisborne to announce that the government is delivering a coastal shipping lifeline for business, residents and the primary sector in the cyclone-stricken regions of the Hawke's Bay and Te Tairawhiti. The government is providing grant funding and an underwrite to Eastland Port for the charter of the Rangitata cargo vessel for an emergency coastal shipping route between Gisborne and Napier, including infrastructural upgrades at the Gisborne port. Mr Speaker, our regions are the backbone of this country, and this investment will ensure our hardest hit regions can get back on their feet quicker.
Why was this investment necessary?
Mr Speaker, Cyclone Gabriel has significantly impacted damaged key roads and rail routes, with the transportation of products between Gisborne to Napier currently taking more than 9 hours by truck. Agriculture and horticulture is vital to the East Coast economy, and this lifeline can get products, vegetables, meat, wool, timber and wine out of Gisborne and into the global market. This investment in the Blue Highway will also speed up recovery efforts, allowing for the swifter delivery of construction and rebuild materials into the East Coast.
What other government investment made this lifeline possible?
Mr Speaker, in 2022, Coastal Bulk, the owner of the Rangitata, was one recipient of the government's $30 million coastal shipping fund, which co-invested with 4 coastal shipping companies to improve domestic shipping services and efficiency, transport reliance, reduce emissions and upgrade maritime infrastructure. Mr Speaker, without government support, this coastal shipping capability between regional ports would not have been available to New Zealand, and this decision would not have been possible.
What activity has there been on the shipping route to date?
Mr Speaker, plenty. Already, the Rangitata has moved 66 40-foot containers of cargo, which has included export of squash and meat products. The ship has made 5 journeys between the 2 ports, with 2 voyages a week into Gisborne and 2 to Napier planned over the coming months, with around 15 containers on each voyage. I'd like to put on record my thanks to the Eastland Group, both the Gisborne and Napier Port and all their workers, as well as the many businesses that are involved, for their brilliant and rapid work to date.
Question number 11, Erica Stanford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Education, does she stand by her statement that Year 8 progress has remained constant since 2017, and why hasn't there been any improvement since 2017?
The Honourable Jan Tinetti.
Yes, there is no evidence of significant change in Year 8 EASTA results since 2012. So therefore, it has remained constant since 2017. There are a variety of reasons why this hasn't increased or improved since 2017. Some of those reasons include the fact that, yes, we have different cohorts each year, that we went through a global pandemic for 2 years where there was a lot of disruption to learning due to lockdown, students and teachers being sick and wider pressures on family life. The government has invested into additional tutoring programs to help students most affected by that lost learning with great results. Other reasons include the widely acknowledged view that the curriculum has been too vague, which is why the government has invested in an evidence-based refresh of the curriculum, so it is very clear what learning progressions must take place each year level, with literacy and numeracy as the priority subjects for implementation this year.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker. Which is correct? Her press release, which states that, quote, forcing children to do an hour of reading, writing and maths every day isn't going to make them enjoy or learn better, or, end quote, or her comments on ZB that, quote, those things are already happening in schools, and I know they are, and I can hand on heart tell you that that was what was happening in my school, end quote.
Mr. Speaker, both are correct.
Oh.
The reason I say that is if you start with teaching an hour a day without doing the pedagogical work that sits underneath it, then that is an absolute waste of time, Mr. Speaker. What we want to focus on as a government is actually making certain that teachers know what to teach, when to teach it, which is why we have the understand, know, do model in the curriculum, and it is already making a difference. When we get to that point, Mr. Speaker, then we can look at such things as time spent during the day, but no, we're going to get the pedagogical side of it right first.
Supplementary question. Who should we believe? The Minister of Education on ZB last week when she stated that an hour a day of maths is already happening, or her literacy and numeracy action plan that states a rather different position, quote, current evidence shows wide variation in maths learning time, end quote.
Mr. Speaker, actually that's what teachers will tell us is happening already in most schools, but let's be clear here, Mr. Speaker, not all schools. And that is why we are focusing on making certain that the pedagogical approaches are right first.
Supplementary question. Why did she issue a press release in response to the National Party's education policy stating that forcing children to do an hour of maths every day isn't going to make them learn better when expert advice provided in the Royal Society Math Report commissioned by her government recommended exactly that?
Mr. Speaker, they also recommended that in conjunction with everything else as their recommendations. As I said, it is with the pedagogical approach. Cherry-picking off bits and pieces of that, Mr. Speaker, will not make a difference to young people's learning.
Supplementary question. Can she explain how it is fair for one child in one school to get an hour of maths a day as recommended by the Royal Society experts, while a child in another school the same age gets far less?
Oh yes, absolutely I can, Mr. Speaker. Some people and some teachers will have a pedagogical approach that will mean that they don't need to do that. It would be inappropriate, as I also said on ZB, that a 5-year-old would spend straight core subjects. In fact, Mr. Speaker, research that I've read over the weekend states that for 5-year-olds that would be too much to have for their cognitive learning ability, Mr. Speaker.
Question number 12, Tamati Coffey.
Tēnā koe te māngai o tēnei whare. My question is to the Minister of Treaty of Waitangi Negotiations and asks, what recent events has he attended for Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, Tamaki Nui, Arua?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Andrew Little.
Mr. Speaker, on Saturday I delivered the Crown apology to Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, Tamaki Nui, Arua, which I'll further refer to as Ngāti Kahungunu from here on in, for its historic breaches, that's the Crown's historic breaches of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and Masterton. The Crown apology acknowledges the acts and omissions which breached the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and its treatment of Ngāti Kahungunu. This includes the forced cession of tens of thousands of acres of land at Maungaroa in 1845, as well as the failure to act in good faith during rapid and extensive land purchases throughout the 1850s and in later public works takings. It was a momentous day for Ngāti Kahungunu on Saturday and their settlement journey, which has not been without its challenges. It marked the first of many steps in a renewed partnership between Ngāti Kahungunu and the Crown.
Supplementary. What else did the Crown apology include?
Mr. Speaker, the deed of settlement contains acknowledgements that historical Crown actions or omissions caused prejudice to Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, Tamaki Nui, Arua, or breached the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles. The apology to Ngāti Kahungunu acknowledged that the Crown did not honour its obligations to respect Te Tino Rangatiratanga o Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, Tamaki Nui, Arua through repeated breaches of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and its principles and for the damage caused to Ngāti Kahungunu. The apology recognises the loss of land at the hands of the Crown, Crown threats to end Pākehā settlement in Wairarapa and Tamaki Nui, Arua, thus depriving Māori landowners of income from leases, the failure to protect Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, Tamaki Nui, Arua from becoming virtually landless, not upholding the spirit of the Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa, Tamaki Nui, Arua tukurangatira of Wairarapa Moana in 1896, and the failure to actively protect te reo Māori.
What cultural redress was included in the settlement?
Mr. Speaker, cultural redress is intended to recognise the cultural, historical and traditional associations of Ngāti Kahungunu within their area of interest. 27 sites were vested back to Ngāti Kahungunu, including the Castle Point Senate Reserve, which Ngāti Kahungunu has gifted back to the Crown. It also included 30 geographic place name changes and an agreed summary of the historical account of the relationship between the Crown and Ngāti Kahungunu.
What financial and commercial redress was included in the settlement?
Mr Speaker, this redress recognises the losses suffered by Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairarapa Tamaki Nuiarua arising from breaches by the Crown of its treaty obligations. The financial and commercial redress is aimed at providing Ngāti Kahungunu with resources to assist them to redevelop their economic and social well-being. Ngāti Kahungunu receive the right to purchase 2 properties, including 70% of the Ngā Umu Forest Crown Forest licensed land, 2 Landcorp Farming Limited farms, Wairio and Rangedale, and 28 specific commercial sites from the Treaty Settlements Land Bank and the Ministry of Education for up to 2 years after settlement date. The total value of financial and commercial redress is $115 million.
Question number 13, Penny Simmons.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Does she stand by her statement on News Hub Nation that Te Pukenga is developing an operating model, quote, as we're going along, end quote, and can she describe what developing that as we're going along actually means?
Mr Speaker,
the
yes.
Honourable Jan Tinetti.
The operating model comprises of a number of components rather than a single document that I expect to evolve over time as the organisation matures. The components of the operating model include the national qualifications and standards developed by Workforce Development Councils, the organisational structure which combines 24 entities, program unification to ensure we have consistent high-quality programs for learners regardless of where in the country they are based, the combination of on-campus, online and on-the-job training, as well as the financial sustainability plan and governance measures.
Supplementary. Does this year's 10% decline in student enrolments at Te Pukenga change the Minister's position that she is, quote, very, very confident, end quote, regarding Te Pukenga, when officials said in June 2022 that Te Pukenga's financial stability was strongly reliant on enrolment growth?
Mr Speaker, no.
Does the Minister consider that Te Pukenga is meeting its commitment to provide exceptional learning experiences and equitable outcomes for Māori and Pasifika when Māori and Pasifika completion and pass rates were so far below target in 2022 that Te Pukenga's response was to reduce targets for 2023?
Mr Speaker, Te Pukenga are moving towards making a model that will be responsive and will be good for Māori and Pacific learners. They set their performance measures, Mr Speaker, through a statement of performance expectations. Many of these are the kinds of things that we would expect from a tertiary provider: course completion, learner satisfaction, number of learners and employers. I will be monitoring these closely.
Supplementary. What does it say about Labour's ability to deliver in vocational education that Te Pukenga is 3 years old now, has cost over $200 million, now needs another $330 million and is still developing an operating model as we're going along?
Mr Speaker, we inherited a big mess in this area, and as I've heard that member say herself, there is no doubt that what we started with when we came to government was quite frankly a mess in both terms of financial stability but also educational outcomes for students. My focus is on ensuring we have sound governance structure, a plan towards financial sustainability and quality education and training for all students.
That concludes oral questions. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Taxation, Annual Rates for 2022-23, Platform Economy and Remedial Matters Bill number 2, third reading.
The Honourable David Parker.
I present a legislative statement on the Taxation Annual Rates for 2022-23, Platform Economy and Remedial Matters Bill number 2.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the Parliament website. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that the taxation annual rates for 2022-23 Platform and Economy and Remedial Matters Bill number 2 be now read a third time. Mr Speaker, this bill has two legs to it. The first is to confirm the annual rates of taxation for the 2022-23 year, which are unchanged from the prior year. And the second is a number of improvements to the tax code which improve outcomes for business and taxpayers. I'll briefly recap the main measures contained in this bill. Firstly, in respect of the platform economy measures, the measures in this bill make the competitive field between participants who are running a more traditional business model. It evens the playing field in their competition with those who list their services via the platform economy. The bill proposes that digital platforms be required to collect and return GST on short-term stay and visitor accommodation, as well as on ride-sharing and food and beverage delivery services. The reasons for this are simple. It is about equity of treatment and fairness. Often people who sell such services through the platform economy can do so currently without charging GST, giving them an advantage over traditional suppliers. And this is the same rationale that was used by the prior national government when they introduced GST on remote services rules that came into effect on 2016. It's probably why when the bill was introduced, Nicola Willis, the finance spokesperson for the National Party, supported this aspect of the bill, but then changed that position in a way that I find incomprehensible since, because it's just wrong. Well, I do comprehend that. In respect of these issues, the OECD has made the point as more and more services are sold via the web, we must make sure that artifices that are enabled through the web cannot be used to create unfairnesses in the tax system. When consumers contract for services in using these platform apps, they're actually buying services from New Zealand service providers. The services are delivered in New Zealand. They're using accommodation or taxi-like services in New Zealand. And yet, because they can construct their contract in a way which notionally at law is a contract in an overseas jurisdiction, they can effectively avoid the effect of GST. That's unfair to the businesses that can't do that. And the Hospitality Association made strong submissions to the Select Committee on behalf of their many hundreds, if not thousands of members, that it's wrong that their members return GST and yet people selling through likes of Airbnb can evade GST. Similarly, I know that the Taxi Federation thinks it's unfair that their members selling services through taxi firms return GST, whereas those through the likes of Uber don't. Now, there has been some suggestion by the opposition exaggerating the effect of this on prices. They have at one stage said that prices would go up by 15% because that's the rate of GST. That's incorrect because it is only effectively the net amount of GST that would be collected from an industry like that after allowing for GST input costs. That is recovered from the platform economy, and that's less than half of the total, around 6%, we think. In respect of the local businesses competing against these large, often overseas-based digital platforms, they welcome this change, and it will improve both the tax system and the businesses of those, the small businesses, mainly in New Zealand, who face unfair competition currently. This will also ensure that New Zealand has access to information from overseas counterparts, which is one of the requirements of the bill. The government also wants to reform the GST apportionment rules to improve fairness and make them less onerous and less complex for businesses, particularly smaller ones, to comply with, and there's various remedial measures in the bill to that effect. It's part of the government's general commitment to reducing the complexity of the tax system where appropriate. There's also modernisation and greater flexibility in relation to the rules applying to the tax treatment of cross-border workers. It's a very technical area that the Select Committee considered well, and I won't go into it. It essentially does this by clarifying how the PAYE, withholding tax, FBT, employer superannuation contribution tax and non-resident contractors tax rules apply. There's also a proposal aimed at producing a more neutral fringe benefit tax outcome between the options of travelling to and from work by car. At the moment, employers can provide car parks to their employees at significant cost, but there's no FBT on that. The last National United Future Act government did actually try to fix that, but there was a bit of pushback, and they didn't pursue that any further. We agree that that leaves an anomaly where employers who would be subsidising more climate-friendly alternative forms of transport were liable for FBT. That's not right, and we fix that by enabling employer-provided public transport fares that are subsidising travel by commuting to and from work to be free of fringe benefit tax. This was a recommendation of the tax working group, and is something I know that the Greens and the Labour Party have championed for a while. We've also adopted, late in the piece, a recommendation from Julianne Genter and the Green Party that FBT exemption be extended to include subsidies for bicycles, electric bikes, scooters and electric scooters. There's a regulation making power to make sure that that can't be abused by purchasing gold-plated scooters or bikes. The bill also proposes to exclude build-to-rent assets from the interest limitation rules in perpetuity. So we just had an intervention from the National Party which explains what they will do if they're elected. They will restore the ability of landlords to deduct interest in full to enable landlords who have vast or large property portfolios to borrow 100% of the costs of their next home purchase, driving up the cost of existing homes and excluding people who live in those homes rather than rent them out as landlords. We don't think that's good policy in New Zealand. We think it's distortionary, and we think that we should instead be encouraging investment into new housing where you get full deductibility now in perpetuity.
Stay around and listen when I speak, Nicola.
Mr Speaker, the government's also aware that businesses are responding to recent North Island floods by providing benefits to their employees in affected areas. We don't think it would be appropriate for those benefits to incur income tax liabilities for the employee or fringe benefit tax obligations for the employer, and therefore the bill proposes exemptions for cash and non-cash benefits provided by employers to employees who have been adversely affected by the North Island flood events up to a maximum of $5,000. It provides that accommodation benefits provided by employees to employers for up to 8 weeks after the start of the relevant flood event are similarly treated so that people can go and help out without creating some tax complications, and that the accommodation benefits of those employees who relocate to the affected areas for a limited duration rebuilding and recovery projects aren't adversely affected by tax consequences. Mr Speaker, those are some of the main features of this bill. These matters are important for New Zealand, and I thank the House for its consideration of these matters as I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed. Nicola Willis.
Today marks yet another assault on New Zealanders' wallets by a Labour government that remains addicted to spending and has never seen a tax it could say no to. That has, after 6 years, delivered nothing but a cost of living crisis, which has led more and more New Zealanders into the food bank queues, into emergency housing, into mortgage arrears, into situations where they're telling their kids they can't afford swimming lessons anymore. And what does David Parker, the Minister of Revenue, the Minister for More Tax, do? He gets up and says, look, I'm thoroughly justified in taxing you more. Well, Mr. Speaker, here on this side of the House, we think it is exactly the wrong time to be taking more of New Zealanders' hard-earned incomes from them. Here on this side of the House, we understand that in a cost of living crisis, people deserve to hold on to a bit more of the cash that should be in their wallets. And the contrast between the two parties couldn't be clearer, because on the other side of the House, we have a government that is taxing at higher levels than we have seen in years. Because they are so addicted to wasteful spending projects like merging TVNZ and RNZ, like dreaming up a new jobs tax, like little rinky-dink schemes that then the Prime Minister has to intervene and dump. Because of that, they've had to rake in a heck of a lot more tax. The tax take is up $43 billion since this government came to power. $43 billion. And the New Zealanders I speak to don't see much to show for it. They see longer waiting lists for hospitals. They see more kids on the State House waiting list. They see no changes in the achievement in our schools, and they say, why am I paying more tax for all of this wasteful spending? Let me break it down, Mr. Speaker. The tax take is up, when you break it down per household, $17,500 per New Zealand household. That's how much more money this addicted to spending government is raking in. So even while real wages are declining, which is to say prices are rising faster than wages, so even while many New Zealanders are falling backwards from one pay cycle to the next, less able to pay the rent, less able to pay the mortgage, even while all of that is happening, inflation is being a sneaky little helper for this rapacious Labour government, because what it's doing is it's robbing New Zealanders twice. First, when they pay for things at the supermarket.
Ms Willis, we've had 2 minutes now of fairly general debate. Just let's start referring to the bill in front of you.
Mr. Speaker, this bill fails to reduce the tax thresholds that New Zealand working taxpayers are subject to. That is a significant failure. It is the very reason why National opposes this bill. Because what a good government would do, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, when introducing the tax bill, is it would adjust those tax thresholds for inflation. The bill we are debating...
Now we'll talk about what's in the bill.
In the bill are the rates for taxation for 2023. And my argument is a very specific one. My argument is that those rates have been set at thresholds which should have been adjusted and which the bill fails to adjust. Now, here on this side of the House, we have observed what is common practice in many jurisdictions around the world when a tax bill like this is introduced. Rather than just confirming that the tax thresholds should hit at the same level as they always have, many countries around the world say, well, actually, inflation means that more and more people are being pushed into the higher brackets at which those thresholds hit. And so our contention throughout the debate on this bill, in fact, for over a year now, has been it is time for the government to adjust those thresholds to allow for that inflation. And this bill represents the final nail in the coffin where the government has failed to adjust those tax thresholds. And the reason it's failed to do that is because it is spending so much money. So this bill is a missed opportunity. National opposes the tax thresholds that are specifically set out in this bill, and I am setting out for you why that is. This bill also contains new taxes. It contains an app tax. Now, this tax is a huge departure from the conventions around GST in New Zealand. We have had a long-standing convention that has been observed by all parties in Parliament that if a business takes less than $60,000 in income for services or sales in a financial year, then that business is exempt from having to pay GST. Now, that long-standing convention is one that we on this side of the House think should be adhered to. But on the other side of the House, what they've now said is, well, that only applies if you're in an old-fashioned business. But if you're actually running a 2023 business that uses technology, that uses a digital platform for your sales, then we think we've found a new excuse to tax you more. And in fact, what this bill says is if you are using a digital platform to reach your customers, whether you're the New Zealand business Zoomy, whether you are Airbnb, whether you are Delivereasy, if you are using technology, God forbid, then we will tax you. And this is a long-standing convention that is being thrown out the window. And mark my words, this new tax will stop innovation because it sends a signal to entrepreneurs in our technology sector that if you come up with a new digital platform, the government will find a way to tax it. And that is the wrong signal to be sending into our economy. It also creates direct costs to everyday New Zealanders because the IRD have warned that the full cost impost of this tax will be passed on to consumers. That's the IRD's advice, Mr. Speaker. And I have had Grant Robertson, the Minister of Finance, tell me many times that inflation has nothing to do with him. It's just a mysterious visitor from overseas and there's nothing he can do with it. And I have consistently taken issue with that because it's just wrong. And this is an exact example of the sorts of policies that lead prices to increase, where the government has a policy choice. It can either introduce the tax and people will pay more for their rideshare, they will pay more for their food delivery, they will pay more for their Airbnb, or it can choose not to. And we will not see the price increases across those services. And National is principled. We say stick with the convention around GST and save New Zealanders yet another cost impost in the middle of the cost of living crisis. I want to turn now to an element of this bill that I find particularly cute, and that is the build to rent provision. I am a huge supporter of build to rent. It is something that New Zealand is missing, that around the world you see developers building long-term, secure rental properties of a high standard. And for various reasons, we've not had that sector grow here. I've put forward a bill that now Chris Bishop has in his name to amend it, to fix the barriers that have been in the way. But what this bill claims to do is it says, oh, we'll give build to rent a leg up by letting build to rent developments exempt their interest. As if that were a novel idea. Mr. Speaker, for decades upon decades, everyone who provides a housing service in New Zealand, just like any other business, has been able to deduct their interest from their tax bill. And it is a huge overturning of that convention that this government has engaged in as part of their war on landlords. When Kiwi Build failed, when their tough talk failed, they turned to their common trick of dividing New Zealanders one against the other, and they said landlords are to blame and we will put new taxes upon them. We will stop them being able to deduct their interest and we will extend the bright line test. Well, you know who the collateral damage in that war is, Mr. Speaker? It is tenants. Rents are up $175 a week since Labor came to power. And as we see landlords lose their interest deductibility, more and more have explicitly warned that they will have to pass on that cost in the form of higher rents for New Zealanders already struggling in a cost of living crisis. And I want to share with this House the human face of that. I knocked on the door of a family in Newlands 2 weeks ago, and I said to them, how are you going? They said, look, we're okay, Nicola, but we thought we did everything right. We scrimped and saved to buy a rental property, and now we're completely stuck without the interest deductibility. We can't make the thing work. But the problem is we could put the rent up. But the family who rent that property, they have 4 kids like us, and we worry about what it will do to them, but we have no choice. That's Labour's idea of kindness. It's not National's idea of kindness. This bill should have reduced tax. New Zealanders should be able to keep more of what they earn.
That's right. Well done. Very good. Rachel Brooking.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to talk on the taxation annual rates for 2022-23 Platform Economy and Remedial Matters Bill number 2. I want to touch on all 3 of those headings, and I'll start with the annual rates. And we've just heard from the previous speaker that the bill does indeed address the annual rates, and that is at clause 3. So it's a very simple provision saying that the income tax imposed by section BB is to be paid at the basic rate specified in Schedule 1 of that Act. And so that Act is not changing. There is no change to the rates. Then, Mr. Speaker, we've heard also from the previous speakers some talk about this platform economy. So what the bill does is it does require digital platform operators to provide information about the providers in New Zealand to IRD. And it does now mean that GST applies to accommodation and some transportation services. And there's some important definitions in the bill, and I'll go to one at clause 103. And that is the definition of electronic marketplace. And that is a marketplace that is operated by electronic means by which a person, the underlying supplier, makes one or more of the following supplies by electronic means through another person, the operator of the marketplace, to a third person, the recipient. 1, a supply of goods, 2, a supply of remote services, and 3, a supply of listed services. So as the previous speakers have said, that this is new to New Zealand Tax Acts, and what it will do is that this GST Act will apply from 1 April 2024, the amendments in this bill, so that there is an equitable application of GST on this electronic marketplace. That is, that it's equitable to those taxi drivers, to the hotels and motels that currently also pay GST. Now, if we touch on some other matters that are also covered in the bill. And we heard from the Minister about fringe benefit tax and exemptions to that. He referred to the car parking exemption. And Mr. Speaker, in my previous life, I was a beneficiary of this law that exempts car parks. I had a very good centrally located car park in the fine city of Dunedin. And of course now, when I'm in Wellington, there's no need for a car park. But as the Minister said, this is going to be extended, this exemption to fringe benefit tax is being extended to public transport. And that we can find at clause 27. Really need some tags, Mr. Speaker. And so that certain public transport, if it's travel between home and work, so that can be for a bus service, a rail vehicle, a ferry, a cable car, or if it's partly funded by a Totally Mobility Scheme administered by Waka Kotahi, this is what we're talking about that will be exempted. And what was, I think, a very exciting development in the committee of the House stage of this bill, Mr. Speaker, was an SOP, supplementary order paper from the government, but very much taking the lead from Julian Genter's work, and that is to include certain self-powered and low-powered vehicles and vehicle share services to be also exempt this FBT. And we heard from the Minister just then that there are going to be regulations. So Mr. Speaker, this is, if we go back to clause 27 and new big CX 19D, It names the vehicles that have been talked about that will have this exemption applied, and there is a bicycle, an electric bicycle, a scooter, an electric scooter, or any other vehicle declared under Section 168A of the Land Transport Act to be a mobility device or not a motor vehicle. And Mr. Speaker, as the Minister said, he noted that it might be that there is a gold-plated scooter somewhere in the world, and perhaps we don't want the fringe benefit tax exemption to apply to that. Well, if that does appear to be a real issue, then regulations can be made, and these can specify the maximum allowable cost of the vehicle and requirements for any vehicles. I note, of course, that a number of members of this House cycle around the great cities of Dunedin and Wellington in cargo bikes, and that they can cost a reasonable amount of money, but as too can centrally located car parks. So that those regulations are there, that ability to make the regulations is there, should they be needed. Then, of course, the Minister also mentioned the other significant change that came from the Committee of the House stage, which was exempting income because of the North Island flooding events. And there's quite a lot in the bill about definitions of those flooding events. And really the purpose here is that where an employee has made a payment for relief, that's not to be subject to fringe benefit tax. And this, Mr. Speaker, I believe has been derived from other emergency legislation in the past where things have happened, earthquakes, for instance, in Canterbury, where people need to buy some new things very quickly, and often that'll be funded by good employers. And then also another thing that I think is interesting, and I'm very pleased to see, is this build to rent exemption from interest limitation rules. So for that to apply, there has to be a 10-year tendency, and it does apply to bigger developments as well. And there's a definition of build to rent in clause 98.3. So, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a good bill. Pleased that the changes were made to it at the committee stage, and I commend it to the House.
Nicely done, Rachel.
Andrew Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, a pleasure to be talking on the taxation annual rates for 2022-23 third reading. As my colleague has already noted, and we have said repeatedly, we will be opposing, and we have opposed this bill for a number of reasons, the first of which is obviously that it enshrines the current tax rates and tax thresholds, which means that New Zealanders are paying far more than they ought to in tax, because as a result of large amounts of wasteful spending from the government, we have seen people getting pushed up into higher tax thresholds, which means they pay higher tax rates on their income as a result of wasteful spending, and which has caused inflation. And don't we know what impact inflation is? And of course the government has had to set about doing a whole lot of stuff, changing benefits, etc., to try and assist hard-working New Zealanders, who in fact they haven't had a benefit, but people on benefits, to try and help them through this period where we have a cost of living crisis. And it will go on, because inflation will continue at similar rates for some period of time. And that is the worrying thing for New Zealanders. And that is why we oppose this bill, because the tax rates continue to ensure that New Zealand households pay more tax than they ought to. And it's interesting when you look at the context, and I know that Nicola Willis spoke about this, is that the $42 billion of extra spending and tax revenue that the government gets every year, in addition to what it was earning back in 2016-17 when they came into office, is just phenomenal amount of increase in spending. And of course, that's been going into government pet projects rather than going back into households and our business owners so that they can fund their businesses, employ more people, grow the economy, increase our exports, which of course have decreased by 10% over the last year or so, and this is this is why the economy is in such a bad shape, because of these policies, and tax is the core of it. And so that's why we do not agree with this bill. That's why we propose that for low to medium income New Zealand families, that they should benefit from tax decreases, which is roughly between about $800 and $1,000 per person or per family. And on top of that, the early education announcement we made just very recently, another $3,500, that would deliver to mums and dads who have children about $5,000 in a reduced tax costs or looking after their children while they're at work. That is the meaningful difference that the national government will bring if we are lucky enough to win the election in later this year in October. So that's the main point about this bill, why we're opposing it. But of course, this bill has a whole stack of other things in it, some of which are quite good, some of which are not. And of course, it already enshrines more taxes for New Zealanders, so that if you are using certain government services, the bill provides for GST to be levied on those. So if you're accessing certain government services, the charges that you might have paid prior to these changes coming into place will now incur a GST liability. And this, of course, is against a backdrop where those levies and those charges have previously been through the House, have previously been through Select Committee, and it has been agreed that they would not incur GST. But we've got a Labor government that just wants more money, and that is why they're imposing a new raft of GST on a whole stack of government services, which in many cases are not warranted and are inappropriate. And of course, they come into play on the 1st of July in a few months' time. The other side, of course, is the issue, the vexed issue around the app tax. And Nicola Willis covered that very well. That is something that, you know, as we go into Easter, many people would have booked or will be thinking about booking accommodation to be able to take their family away for a few days over Easter period. And of course, if you were to pay for $400 of accommodation, that's probably 2 nights. You may need 3 nights if you're going away all of Easter, but let's say it's 2 nights, you've got to pay GST on top of that. That's another $60. If you get a cleaning service to clean the batch after you've hired it for the couple of nights, of course, you'll now be paying GST on that amount. So all up, you know, that's just adding on about another $85 of costs to New Zealanders who want to go away and have a few days away. And this is the impact of this app tax that the government has been at the forefront of trying to push through. It was interesting, some of the submissions we had on this stuff. Obviously, the world is moving towards trying to do these types of taxes, but of course, New Zealand's at the forefront of it. We're at the bleeding edge of it. And there is no necessity to bring this in. We do not need to meet the OECD requirements at this stage. We need to be mindful of them. We need to be prepared, but we do not need to be bringing in these types of changes already. And of course, what it's going to do is to have, to some extent, it's going to stop certain global players wanting to come into New Zealand because they know their products will be in a different tax regime, which will affect probably a hard-pressed New Zealand tourist industry. And of course, it distorts the GST proposals that New Zealand already has in place. And the main thing, of course, is yet again, this government has broken a fundamental tax tenet, which is anyone under 60,000 does not have to account for GST on their activities. That has been encased in law and been the practice for decades, and yet this government again believes that it's got the divine right to change those rules, and this is what's happening under these new changes to this app tax that the government's bringing in. And of course, related to that, the first tenet that the government broke, that Mr. David Parker broke, was the issue around interest deductibility. And of course, there has been a fundamental tenet in tax for decades again, which says that if you have assessable income means that it's subject to tax, you should be able to deduct expenditure to offset that income. And of course, what did this government do when they first came in? They broke that cardinal rule and remove the interest deductibility on people who have properties that they rent out to people, pay tax, pay rates on it, pay all the good stuff, and provide a home for people who want to rent. And of course, now we see reinserted back into this bill the tax deductibility for long-term rent accommodation, which means that you have to have a minimum of 20 buildings or houses in one area. We changed the rules around whether it's contiguous or not. But, of course, it now allows interest deductibility only for those particular build-to-rent type of assets. And again, this may help the renting market, and we do need people to come into the renting market and have long-term rental arrangements. But what we have seen is a decrease in the rental market, and as Nicola Willis quoted, $175 increase per week in the costs of renting for hard-working New Zealanders, perhaps some of the most vulnerable New Zealanders, and yet this has been the perverse outcome of this stupid rule of removing interest deductibility and implying a whole lot of other increases on the requirements on landlords, and of course there's been a natural sort of market reaction to that. So that is a bad thing in terms of what it's done to the rental market, but we do like to see more build to rent, but we just wish that all those many thousands of houses that would have otherwise been rented have now been sold and have gone out of the rental market and made it harder for people. Now, the cross-border workers reform, there's an area here. We have a number of people coming into New Zealand, if they can get through the immigration rules, of course. Hopefully they're starting to come through and come and help hard-working businesses. But one of the proposals here is to allow cross-border workers to actually account for their own tax. And that is a good thing, because some of them will come here, they might have come from Switzerland to help on special type of printing machine, Heidelberg or whatever, as an example. They come out for a specific period of time. They are the ones best able to understand New Zealand's increasingly complicated tax rules. They can pay their own taxes here rather than necessarily having the employer to do it, but by agreement they can do it. And that's a good thing to help support small businesses and businesses in general in New Zealand. But look, there are some improvements, but the fundamental issue about this bill, it continues to layer a heavy burden of tax on ordinary New Zealanders, and they should be paying less tax, not more tax.
The Honourable Dr. Deborah Russell.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to offer a moment of calm and quiet and rational analysis on this excellent bill, the Annual Rates Bill. It's a bill that the Annual Rates Bill happens every year as a matter of law. We are required, every year, the Parliament is required to confirm the rates of tax that are paid every year. It has to be done by the end of the tax year, and that happens to be the 31st of March. Today is the 28th of March. We're getting in with 3 days to spare on getting that one done. So we simply do have to confirm the annual rates, and it's a fairly routine and regular process each year. I want to talk a little bit about the problems that the opposition has alleged exist in this bill, which I think is really demonstrates misunderstanding on their part, just a bit of misunderstanding. Let me talk first about the platform-based tax. Now, the idea behind this tax, it is not a new tax. All it is applying GST to people who provide goods and services via a platform. There's an important point here. Ordinarily, a small business can opt out of the GST rules. So as a matter of law, there is a threshold set in the Goods and Services Tax Act. It's in section 51 of the Goods and Services Tax Act. It sets a threshold of $60,000. And any business or any activity that has a turnover that is more than $60,000 is required by law to be registered for GST, to charge GST on the goods and services they supply. They can always claim back the costs that they themselves pay in GST as well. So, thinking about it for a moment, Mr. Chair, you of course will realise that any motel will likely have a turnover of more than $60,000 each year, will collect more than $60,000 in sales. Taxi drivers will collect more than $60,000 in sales every year. So motels and taxi drivers are required by law to be registered for GST. However, as it turns out, so that means, yeah, any ordinary old business is paying GST in that space. Now, I just want to go to another section of the Goods and Services Tax Act for a moment. It's section 6 of the Goods and Services Tax Act. Now, any entity that is engaged in continuous or regular